Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So on this show, we've talked a lot about a lot of different environmental justice issues. We've talked about things like water quality, water issues. We've talked about industrial air pollution and carcinogens. We've talked about industrialization and zoning, all the issues associated with that. And we've talked about public health, the ways in which these contaminants and these issues affect the public health of people living in these communities. And so we're going to keep talking about these issues. But while we've been talking about environmental justice and the need to fight for it, we have not really talked about environmental justice communities, right? How do we identify these communities? How do you know if you're living in a community that is dealing with environmental injustice, right? How does a community become an environmental justice community where they're dealing with these issues? We haven't really talked about that and really identified what that is. And so that's what I want to do on this episode of the podcast. So stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening.
I was walking, and I'm usually walking through Jackson Ward and then down towards the north side area, and I realized the air is different. Once you cross over past Virginia Union, the air is lighter, you're able to breathe better. You know, even my running and my walking, you can look at my stats and see how I'm faster, you know, how my heart rate is better and all of that. And I couldn't figure it out until I started doing a little research about the air quality. And I realized that it's because we don't have any green space. We don't have enough trees. We have so much, you know, brick and mortar and concrete and all of those things that we were talking about that's causing so many issues.
Why did they pick Warren County?
I think for three reasons. We were poor, we were African American, we were politically impotent.
We will not allow Warren County to become a dump site.
Those are the sounds of activists, people fighting for environmental justice in their communities. And when you listen to the issues and the pain that they're experiencing and the change they want to see happen, it's important for us as we listen and think about people speaking out and fighting against environmental injustice. We need to be able to identify these areas and understand what these communities are and what leads people to target them for areas of pollution and expansive industrialization. And so I want to just talk a little bit on this episode about how we identify and define these communities that are dealing with these issues and how we can think about more clearly ways of ensuring their protection and their health and well-being. And so when we think about that, the first thing I thought about was how do people actually define an environmental justice community? Is that even the right language to use when we talk about these areas? And so if you go online, if you Google search environmental justice community, you'll get lots of different definitions and ways of identifying these communities. So for instance, if you look at different states, for instance, the state of Connecticut, they define an environmental justice community as a distressed municipality based on, quote, high unemployment and poverty, aging housing stock, and lower declining rates of growth in job creation, population, and per capita income. Or census blocks where 30% of the population is living below 200% of the federal poverty line. So the idea is basically an environmental justice community, according to Connecticut, is a place with high unemployment, lots of poverty, old houses, and basically poor people. That's how they identify that community. So if you look at Massachusetts, they would define an environmental justice community as a neighborhood where one of these criteria are true, where the annual median household income is 65% or less of the statewide annual median household income, or where minorities make up 40% of the population or more, where 25% or more of the households identify as speaking English less than very well, or where minorities make up 25% or more of the population and the annual median household income doesn't exceed 150% of the statewide annual median household income. So In Massachusetts, they look at how much money your household makes in your neighborhood, how many quote-unquote minorities live in your neighborhood, and how many people basically speak English as a second language or not at all. So language, demographics, income basically determine what is identified as an environmental justice community in Massachusetts. It's interesting. New Mexico, they have a definition. They say a community or neighborhood composed predominantly of persons of color or a substantial portion below the poverty line that is subjected to a disproportionate burden of environmental hazards and or experiences a significantly reduced quality of life relative to the surrounding comparative neighborhoods. That would be an environmental justice community. And so, good for New Mexico. So they added in the idea of experiencing certain environmental hazards disproportionately. That's the first definition that's done that by a state agency since I've been looking. Because I'll have to be honest with you, these definitions of an environmental justice community, they're not helpful. They're not helpful at all because what they're doing is they're looking at the existing situation in these neighborhoods outside of the actual environmental damage they're experiencing and then kind of tagging them as an environmental justice community without the actual environmental issues being part of the discussion. Because that's the real issue. The issue is not simply that these are poor communities or they're predominantly minority communities or they're immigrant communities. The issue is the environmental hazard that they're experiencing as a result of the planning and the decision making from those in positions of power. That's the issue here. So when we think about what an environmental justice community looks like and what it is, these things may be true about them, but that in and of itself isn't why they're marching and protesting and fighting for change. If you read those, I agree, we should deal with those issues too. This high levels of poverty, unemployment, we should really have policies that address those. But those aren't environmental issues. They can deal with that without having to be dumped on by industries and factories and other operations in the state. We can think about those differently. And I would argue that if you deal with one, it doesn't necessarily change the other on its own. So if you lifted up these minority communities out of poverty, if they were able to get jobs, if they were able to support themselves in ways that would allow them to grow and flourish, that doesn't mean they wouldn't get these environmental hazards dumped on them. Because as we know from the research, race is the primary factor for whether or not you will see disproportionate amounts of pollution in a neighborhood. It's not income, it's not education, it's not unemployment, it's not even language or citizenship status. It is clearly race. And so as a result of that, we know that changing some of those other issues that are being identified in these definitions won't necessarily pull that community out of experiencing these environmental hazards in a disproportionate manner. And so that's why we have to really think about how we describe these communities and what we're actually talking about when we discuss environmental justice communities, neighborhoods, whatever we want to call them. And so I had to keep looking for better definitions. I need a better definition in this. And so I kept looking. I found one from the California Environmental Justice Alliance, and they say that an environmental justice community is a neighborhood surrounded by freeways and industrial facilities, small towns without clean drinking water or sidewalks, who are excluded from public investments, cities with large refineries where the residents live next door and are exposed to more pollution than those who live miles away. Now, the reason I love this definition is because they're not talking about who lives in the neighborhood or what their conditions are like. They're talking about what the people in those neighborhoods experience from the state, from the city, from the county as it relates to environmental hazards. That's what actually defines the community as an environmental justice neighborhood. You're surrounded by roads and freeways, facilities, industrial facilities. You don't have clean drinking water. You don't have clean air. You don't have the infrastructure you need to do your daily routines and live your life. That is the issue. It's not because you don't have enough money. It's not It's almost like you're pointing the finger at the neighborhood as it being the issue, as opposed to people making decisions that impact them in a negative way, so on and so on. And so that was a good one. I like that one. Otherwise, it's hard to find a good definition. And so I started to think, well, maybe I'm thinking about it wrong. I'm having the wrong understanding and using the wrong search terms to talk about these issues. So I kept digging. And there's some other ways that people describe these neighborhoods. Other terms that are used, which I think are a lot more helpful for our understanding. So one I found, which I'm sure you've heard before, fence line communities. It's literally a community with a fence next to a facility. I found a definition of a fence line community. It says that a fence line community is immediately adjacent to highly polluting facilities, fossil fuel infrastructure, industrial parks, or large manufacturing plants, and is directly affected by the traffic, noise, the operations, the chemical, and the fossil fuel emissions of the operation of those facilities. That's perfect. That describes so many communities around the country, around the world, and what they deal with. And it's separate from the people in the community. It's not about who they are. It's about what they are doing to that community. That's the issue. And so if you live in a neighborhood, obviously you're working, you're supporting your family, and then a large facility moves in next door to where you are. They put a fence up around that facility, mark it off, and they start operating and polluting and damaging the air and polluting the water with their operations. You are now on the fence line. You've become a fence line community as a result of that decision. That's what happened. Now, it's true that those communities where they put those facilities are more often than not communities that are predominantly people of color, predominantly lower income. Oftentimes they're rural. Oftentimes they're immigrants or non-native English-speaking communities. That's true, but the decision was already made to put the facility there and to dump on those individuals in particular. They were targeted for that. And so we need to make sure that we don't somehow conflate the idea that because the neighborhood is poor, that the neighborhood is predominantly African American, Hispanic, or whatever, that that's the reason why there's so much more environmental pollution in those neighborhoods. That is not the case. The case is they've been targeted by decision makers, by regulatory agencies, and by industries to have those facilities in those areas. That's what happened. Here's another good definition from the NAACP. They say that most fence line communities in the United States, and I would argue around the world, are low-income individuals and communities of color who experience systematic oppression and environmental racism. Absolutely. That's what's happening, and that's why we're seeing what's going on in those communities. And it's just an extension of the lived realities of those communities, because it's not just income inequality, it's not just criminal injustice, it's not just lack of access to education, to health care, all these other issues that are faced by these communities. You add on top of that environmental racism, environmental injustice, and you continue the cycle of consistently working to suppress and oppress and depress these communities. That's what's happening. And when you're on the fence line, it's a clear indication that your livelihood, your neighborhood, is of very little value to the decision makers in your state and in your city. And so we're getting to a better way of describing these communities now. We went from environmental justice community to fence line community. I like that a little bit better. Another one that I liked a lot was frontline communities. Several agencies define frontline communities as those communities that experience the impacts of climate change, quote, first and worst. So they get hit the hardest, they hit the quickest when effects of climate change are seen in our environment. And they also would tell you, and I would agree, that these communities that are frontline communities are overwhelmingly and disproportionately people of color, and they experience the heaviest and the hardest burdens of climate change. Now, we think about climate change, you think about things like extreme weather events, heat waves, massive snowstorms, droughts, floods. These things are increasing as the climate is being changed due to our reliance and persistent fossil fuel usage. And we're seeing more and more of these events happen more and more frequently at stronger and stronger rates. And so these frontline communities experience some of them the worst. And the definition will go on to say that these communities include, but are not limited to, and they have a long list of people, of places where these communities experience these impacts first and worst. People of color, low-income people, people who experience homelessness, unemployed, underemployed people, incarcerated people. We don't think about the incarcerated as being an environmental justice community or a group of people who need to be protected from these environmental hazards, but they're there, right? Immigrants, people who live in subsidized low-income housing. All of these groups are considered to be frontline communities. I understand we're all fighting to address the issue of climate change, and we should really work hard to change how we use energy, how we use our water. We should really think about changing just the way that we operate as a society to deal with climate change. But when the issues start happening, these communities are the ones that get hit the hardest, they get hit the quickest, and they have the most damage done to their communities and to their livelihoods. The first thing I think about, because my family's from Haiti, all those Caribbean islands, when those hurricanes come through, they're stronger, they're bigger, they are more enduring when they pass over, and they come more frequently. And all of those islands are frontline communities. They get hit the hardest, hit the quickest, and it's so difficult for them to recover from all of these events that they can't even get back on their feet before the next one comes. And then the next one comes. Then the next one comes. Over and over and over. Climate change is driving that, but protecting those communities and trying to deal with the impact and the fallout becomes an issue that those communities have to face that a lot of us are insulated from. We have ways of protecting ourselves if we have more affluence, if we live in certain neighborhoods that aren't as impacted. We can deal with that more than some of these communities can. I'm thinking about Puerto Rico, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, all of these Caribbean areas, they're on the front line. And so we should also think about those communities as well when we talk about environmental justice, because sure, there's not large industry, there aren't large facilities in those areas, but because of climate change, when the events come, they have to bear the burden to a much greater extent than anyone else living anywhere else in the world, really. And they have less resources to recover once the event has taken place and passed through. So frontline communities are a way of describing communities that are adversely and disproportionately impacted by climate change. Fence line communities are communities that are next to, adjacent to, in the vicinity of large polluting facilities and industries. And I think under the umbrella of environmental justice, we have to consider all these different types of communities when we talk about the issues. So when you're fighting for climate change and you're trying to change policy and you're trying to change the way things are done, keep those frontline communities in mind. When you're talking about how we use energy and how we produce it in your country and our country and where these facilities go, these high polluting facilities, think about those fence line communities. When we're talking about the toll it takes to just live in these areas and how important it is for us to ensure that everyone is protected, we're talking about environmental justice, and all of these things matter. And as we push and fight for changes to be done, we have to be mindful of the different challenges that these communities face, because what's happening in one part of the country is different than the other parts, and one part of the world is different from other parts as well. So if you live in a country that's highly industrialized, has lots of industry and facilities and plants and produces a lot of material goods and things of that nature, it's going to be important to think about where those facilities are located. Where are you putting those plants and those facilities? And are you putting them next to vulnerable communities? They were vulnerable before, but now with that plant next to them, you have turned their environment into a hazard. And now it's an environmental justice issue, whereas before it was an economic issue or a health issue or maybe an educational or employment issue. And now you've elevated it to environmental justice that needs to be done. And now we have to take steps to address those issues because we know they're not equipped to manage all that pollution, all of those hazards coming in a direction. And so we have to think about those things. We have to really be mindful of the fact that it matters who you put these things around. And we know that people with more influence, more wealth, people who are in the majority will have more of an ability to keep those facilities out of their neighborhoods. But now we have to think about who's vulnerable, who doesn't have that voice. We need to all collectively work towards keeping these polluting facilities out of their neighborhoods because they actually stand to lose more and to be more heavily impacted if they come than other wealthier parts of a country, of a state, of a city. And so all of these things matter. And so when I think about an environmental justice community, we have to be more specific. What we might want to say is we need to fight for environmental justice in our communities, and then we need to be very specific about what the issues are that we're fighting against and what we can do to help reduce the impacts and the burden that they're experiencing. And so when I talk about environmental justice on this podcast, hopefully I'm being very specific. Are we talking about clean water, clean air? Are we talking about disaster relief and recovery? Are we talking about agriculture and farming? Are we talking about industries and pollution? Like, what are we talking about? Because ultimately, what's important is that people are protected from the issues related to climate change and issues related to large industries and exploitative practices that extract from communities and then leave them with all the pollution and the burdens that come along with it. That's what we're trying to avoid. That's what we don't want to see. That's what the fight and the push is all about. We don't want situations where there's resources in a particular area or there's a nice river that we can use for our operations. And in doing so, we heap on and create more problems for a community that's already vulnerable because of these other issues of justice that need to be addressed. Whether it's income, whether it's education, whether it's criminal justice reform that's needed, all these different things. And then you add to that an aging infrastructure, you add to that unemployment, you add to that environmental hazards. And now you're decimating these communities and you're harming them beyond repair. And so we need to think about those things as well. And so when we think about environmental justice and we're trying to identify these communities, we need to think about all of those things. Think about the fact that these are the most vulnerable, most marginalized groups. And then as a result, these facilities are coming and they're being more and more impacted by them. It's just not good. And you might be in a community where, hey, we're fighting for other issues. Environmental justice is not really on our radar. We're not really thinking about that because we're trying to fix these other things that we need. We're trying to fix our schools. We're trying to fix our roads. We're trying to fix our water and sewer systems. And we're trying to, deal with policing and other issues that we're experiencing. And that's fine. I mean, keep fighting, keep pushing. Just remember that your community that's dealing with all those issues can become a target for large industry, for large mining operations, things that people can see as a way of extracting from your community what they would see as valuable while also piling on the environmental pollution and the burdens that nobody else wants. And so we have to keep these things in mind. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, and we have to keep ourselves aware of these issues and make sure that we look out for each other and fight for the right kind of change. And so that's what we have to do. Don't allow these definitions, these ways of identifying communities to take you away from the actual issues that we're pushing against. So if you live in a fence line community, let's reduce those emissions, get that plant out of there. If you live in a frontline community, let's work on how we can reduce our carbon emissions, how we can deal with climate change, and how we can work together to have a more sustainable future. And if you live in neither of those, link up with somebody and start helping to make positive change around here, because we can all do it together. And that's our episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab podcast, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.